Part 8. A 600 BC Phoenician ship sailing to America. Is there evidence for such a thing? Absolutely, and I'm going to talk about it in this video, but there are some other things that I need to mention first to lead up to it. So there was a documentary on the History Channel called Who Really Discovered America? It mentioned the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and how the Book of Mormon says that Lehi's group sailed from the Arabian Peninsula to America at approximately 600 BC. The documentary estimated that it would have taken Lehi's group over a year and a half to sail in a 600 BC ship from the Arabian Peninsula across the Indian and Pacific Oceans to the west coast of Central America. The documentary then suggested that the ship could have arrived there, but that the people on it probably would have died before arriving. Now, with God, anything is possible. But where did the History Channel get the idea that Lehi sailed to Central America by crossing the Indian and Pacific Oceans? Well, ever since the 1830s, there have been people in the church who have believed that Lehi's group landed on the west coast of Central or South America, even though there's no record of Joseph Smith ever saying that. One source comes from a piece of paper during the Kirtland era. This piece of paper had notes on it from Frederick G. Williams. One of the notes said that Lehi landed on the continent of South America in Chile, 30 degrees south latitude. People then assumed that Joseph Smith must have told him that, but there's no evidence that Joseph ever said that. In 1845, a year after Joseph Smith's death, the exact same statement was written at the end of a copy of Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. Some people in the church have assumed that Joseph wrote that statement, but he didn't. It was John Bernheisel who had that copy and wrote the statement, as well as many more of his own personal notes in that copy. Another source is the September 15th, 1842 edition of the Times and Seasons newspaper during the Nauvoo era. There's an article in this edition called Facts Are Stubborn Things. It says that Lehi went down by the Red Sea to the Great Southern Ocean and crossed over to this land and landed a little south of the Isthmus of Darien, which is Panama. Some people in the church have assumed that this was either written by Joseph Smith or at least approved by him, but there are a few important points that strongly suggest otherwise. First, whenever Joseph wrote an article in the Times and Seasons, he always included his name at the end of the article. This article has no name at the end of it. Second, the ideas and wording in the article match the ideas and wording of Benjamin Winchester, who wrote several other similar articles in other publications. Third, in early September 1842, even though Joseph was currently the chief editor of the Times and Seasons, he was constantly on the run and hiding at that time because Governor Boggs of Missouri had accused Joseph of his attempted assassination. Also, John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff were very sick at that time, which left the responsibility of the Times and Seasons newspaper to Joseph's younger brother, William Smith, who, at times in the past, had opposed his brother Joseph and been involved with other apostates. William was also friends with Benjamin Winchester and agreed with his beliefs about the Central American ruins being the ruins of the Book of Mormon people, which is another topic that needs another video in and of itself, but I'll briefly mention that in 600 BC, the Mayan civilization in Central America was already well established, but Lehi's group came to an uninhabited land. They did not meet and assimilate in with any other culture. And the Mayan pyramids, which some church members get excited about, even as far back as the 1830s, are not estimated to have been built until a few hundred years after the Book of Mormon is over, and their structure is against the law of Moses anyways, whereas the Hopewell Mound-builder temple sites match the structure of the temple site in ancient Jerusalem. Also, the Mayan pyramids and many other Mayan artifacts are nearly an exact match to pyramids and artifacts found over in East Asian countries. The Mayans are not Book of Mormon people. I'm sure they're included in the other sheep category that Jesus told the Nephites he was going to visit, because cultures all the way from Alaska down to Chile have stories of a white god who visited their people. But the Mayans are connected to East Asia, not Israel. Anyway, so those are the main reasons why some people in the church have assumed ever since the 1830s that Lehi's group landed somewhere on the west coast of Central or South America, and therefore that's what the History Channel had to work with for their documentary. But in reality, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that Joseph Smith ever said where Lehi's group landed. Now this brings us to the question, is it possible that Lehi's group crossed the Atlantic Ocean instead? And the answer is yes, and there's real, non-LDS evidence to back it up. So let's get into it. First, there are Native American tribes that belong to the Iroquois family who say they have ancestors who came from the Atlantic Ocean in boats and arrived somewhere in the Florida, Georgia area. This area also contains the oldest Hopewell Mound-builder ruins, dating back to nearly 600 BC. The Mohawk tribe, who are Iroquois and currently live up in New York, will sometimes have an alligator on some of their artifacts, because it is a special animal to them. The reason why the alligator is special to them is because they say the alligator is the first animal their ancestors saw when they got off the boat. Are there alligators in Florida and Georgia? Definitely. And as mentioned in part 1, the next oldest Hopewell Mound-builder ruins are found in Tennessee that also date back to the 500s BC. And if you remember from the Book of Mormon, a few years after Lehi's group landed in America and Lehi died, the two oldest sons, Laman and Lemuel, wanted to kill their younger brother Nephi because they were angry that he was the new leader of the group. So God warned Nephi to take whoever would follow him and leave that land and travel north. The Algonquin family of Native American tribes also say they have ancestors who came from the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes area. I'll get more into this later in the video, but right now I want to stick with the Florida-Georgia area and talk about the 600 BC Phoenician ship that sailed to America, basically twice, using two different routes. The first time was in 2009, and the second time was just recently in 2019. This ship is called the Phoenicia Expedition, and a documentary on it was made by the BBC in 2009. The ship was built to test the validity of a statement that the Phoenicians had written around 500 BC, which claimed that the Phoenicians had been circumnavigating Africa for 100 years, which means since about 600 BC. So in 2007, a group led by a man named Philip Beale began building the ship by hand in Syria in the exact way that Phoenician ships were made around 600 BC, and by using traditional Phoenician methods and raw materials from the area. Everything was built by hand, even the sail. So they left Syria, sailed down the Red Sea, and eastward to Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. And just for a side note, Oman is also a possible location where Lehi's group set sail, because the Book of Mormon mentions that after they left Jerusalem on foot, they traveled southeast along the Red Sea until they reached a place called Nahom, which archaeologists discovered that Nahom was actually a real place. Then Lehi's group left Nahom and traveled eastward until they reached a very fertile land on the coastline. That would put them in the Oman area, where there is very fertile land on the coastline. Anyway, so the Phoenicia expedition left Oman on October 26, 2009, just after harvest season. And at that time of year, the winds in that area blow southwest, and because the Indian Ocean currents also go that direction, it was easy for them to sail down along the east coast of Africa. After making several stops along the east coast of Africa and Cape Town, South Africa, they left Cape Town on March 22nd of 2010. And of course, the plan was to go up along the west coast of Africa and into the Mediterranean Sea. But what happened was that the natural southern Atlantic Ocean currents and winds took them northwest towards the Gulf of Mexico. And no matter how hard they tried to get the boat to go east back to Africa, they couldn't do it. June 12, 2010 was when they reached their furthest west point before finally being able to get the ship to go east again. That point was about 350 miles away from Puerto Rico. So they could have continued to go right into the Gulf of Mexico if they wanted to. But their goal was to circumnavigate Africa, and so they headed back towards the Mediterranean Sea and landed in Lebanon on October 12, 2010. So from the time the Phoenicia expedition left Oman to the time they got to their most westward point was 229 days. So that's about 7.5 months. But 71 of those days they were docked and staying at their various stops. So it was really 158 days on the ocean to their most westward point, which is a little more than 5 months. The Book of Mormon says that before Lehi's group set sail, they collected much fruits and meat from the wilderness and honey in abundance. So if Lehi's group set sail in October just after harvest season to collect enough food for the journey and then made none or very few stops along the way, which the Book of Mormon doesn't mention whether they made stops or not, they could have made it to Florida in about 6 months, maybe 7 if they did make some stops along the way to resupply. This would have put them in Florida around April or May, just in time to plant the seeds they brought from Jerusalem to grow crops, which the Book of Mormon says that's what they did when they landed, and their crops did grow exceedingly. Another interesting thing is that the oldest Hopewell sites, which are in the Florida-Georgia area, are nearly the exact same latitude as Jerusalem is. And you'll find some of the best soil in the world in the eastern United States, so their seeds from Jerusalem would have no problem growing in Florida. And I'm actually really glad that it took me this long to finally get around to making Part 8, because now I can talk about the Phoenicia Expedition's 2019 voyage. This time, they actually wanted to sail to America, but this time they took a different route. They set sail from Tunisia on September 29, 2019, stopped off in Spain, Morocco, the Canary Islands, and then sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in the Dominican Republic on December 31, 2019, New Year's Eve. After they left the Dominican Republic, they sailed up to Florida and arrived in Miami on February 4, 2020. So, could a 600 BC ship get from the Middle East to America? Definitely. And it's been done twice using different routes. And as mentioned before, both the Iroquois and Algonquins say they have ancestors who came across the Atlantic Ocean in boats. Now I could just end the video here and be satisfied that a lot of cool information was shared, but I've got more to share concerning what the Algonquins say about their ancestors, so I'm going to do it. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying these are the only ancestors of Native Americans. I've heard people from various tribes talk about the yellow race who came from the West, meaning Asians. I've also heard people from other tribes talk about having ancestors who were on this continent when it split away from Europe and Africa, creating the Atlantic Ocean, which the Egyptians call the False Sea. Anyway, that's all stuff for other videos, but the Book of Mormon is specifically about the ancestors who came from the East. So I've talked about what I believe is the route and landing for Lehi's group in America, which corresponds with what the Iroquois say about their ancestors from the East, and with the oldest Hopewell ruins. But what about Mulek's group? And even before Mulek and Lehi, what about the Jaredites, who arrived many hundred years before them? So the Book of Mormon says that the Lord brought Lehi into the land south, and he brought Mulek into the land north, which is also where he brought the Jaredites. The Algonquins' story corresponds more with the Jaredites and Mulekites, who both came into the land north at different periods in history. Now, as for the land north and the land south, I'll go into more detail about them when I make part 10, but for right now, I'll just mention that the Kaw tribe in Kansas says that the lower Mississippi River used to be a massive inlet coming off of the Gulf of Mexico that stretched as far north as St. Louis, Missouri, but that after a massive earthquake, it shrunk into what is now the lower Mississippi River. And I'll also talk more about these massive New Madrid earthquakes that happen every few hundred years in Part 10. And also, the Great Lakes up in the northern United States and Canada used to have a much higher water level, causing Lake Michigan and Lake Erie to both stretch further south down into Indiana. The remnants of some of these higher water levels eventually became uninhabitable swamps that weren't drained until the 1800s. And there are no ancient Adena or Hopewell mound-builder sites anywhere beyond these ancient shorelines, so we know that these ancient shorelines existed during their time periods. So almost all of what is now the eastern United States used to be surrounded by large bodies of water, or seas, as the Israelites would have called them. Anyway, back to the Algonquins. They say they have ancestors who came from the Atlantic Ocean in what they call turtle boats. And as a side note, the Book of Mormon says the Jaredites came across the ocean to America in boats that were tight like unto a dish. And they could be buried under the waves and flipped upside down and not have water leak into them as long as the doors were shut. Anyway, so the Algonquins say that these ancestors came from the Atlantic in these turtle boats down the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada, and they spread throughout the Great Lakes area. The Ojibwa tribe's Red Sky Migration Chart is one example of this journey. Here's the original chart, which also shows the turtle boats over on the right side. And here's the geographical interpretation of the chart. You can just pause the video to look over it if you want. Now, the Great Lakes area is the main area where the Adena mound-builder civilization lived. Because information about them is so sparse, their civilization is loosely estimated to have lived somewhere between 2000 BC to 300 BC. The Jaredites from the Book of Mormon lived from approximately 2200 BC to 600 BC until they destroyed themselves in a civil war. Their final battles were in the same area where the Nephites' final battles were, which is the Cumorah area in New York, between Lake Ontario and the Finger Lakes. After the Jaredites destroyed themselves, a group called the Mulekites arrived in ancient America sometime after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The Book of Mormon says the Lord brought them into the land north, and they found the last Jaredite survivor named Coriantumr, and he lived with them for about 9 months and was then buried by them. So if the Mulekites came into the land north by the St. Lawrence Seaway, that would bring them down into Lake Ontario. And since the final Jaredite battles were in the Cumorah area just south of Lake Ontario, it's possible that that's where the Mulekites found Coriantumr. But the Mulekites didn't stay in that area because the Book of Mormon tells us that the Lord led them to settle in a land which they would eventually call the land of Zarahemla, after King Zarahemla, who was a descendant of Mulek. And even though the land of Zarahemla is further north than where Lehi's people landed, the Book of Mormon says it's part of the land south. So, the Lord brings the Mulekites into the land north, but continues to lead them to the land of Zarahemla in the land south, where they settle and their civilization grows. And if you remember from part 1, the state of Iowa is the other area in the United States where Hopewell mound-builder sites date back to the 500s BC. And in Doctrine and Covenants, section 125, the Lord told Joseph Smith to build a city across from Nauvoo on the Iowa side of the Mississippi River, and to call that city Zarahemla. And another side note, as I mentioned in part 1, the Book of Mormon tells us that the river Sidon ran along the east side of Zarahemla. The word Sidon is related to fish in Phoenician, Greek, and Egyptian. The Native American name for the Mississippi River is Namesi Sipu, which means river of fish. Pretty cool, huh? And the Mississippi River is on the east side of Iowa and the spot where the Lord told Joseph to build a city named Zarahemla. The church actually owned more land over on the Zarahemla side of the river than they did on the Nauvoo side. And some church members lived over there, but they lost it all when the mobs drove them out of Nauvoo and they went to Utah. Anyway, so again, the Mulekites could have come down the St. Lawrence Seaway to Lake Ontario, explored that area, and found Coriantumr the last Jaredite, and then to Iowa, where the Hopewell Mound-builder sites dating back to the 500s BC are, and also where the Lord told Joseph to build a city and call it Zarahemla. And one last side note, Mulek was a son of King Zedekiah of Judah. Now the Bible tells us that when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC, the Babylonian king killed the sons of Zedekiah. But the name Mulek means little prince or little king. So Mulek must have been a baby, perhaps still in his mom's womb when Zedekiah's other sons were killed. Perhaps the mom escaped Jerusalem with a group of people, but one way or another, this baby Mulek ended up in the Mulekite group that escaped Jerusalem and eventually came over to ancient America, as the Book of Mormon says. Then Mulek, this little prince, grew up to be the king of the Mulekites because of his birthright. And then a few hundred years later, Zarahemla, being a descendant of Mulek, was the king of the people when the Nephites moved further north under King Mosiah I and discovered the Mulekites, or the people of Zarahemla as the Nephites called them. Well, there it is. I hope you enjoyed part 8, and stay tuned for part 9. In the meantime, here's a list of some people who have helped me learn over the years and find tons of non-LDS sources that support the Book of Mormon. So go do your own research and have fun.